Here we are once again, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to another Living Hope Today study. Today we find ourselves in Ezra chapter 8. And we end up at the conclusion of a sequence. King Cyrus of Persia has issued the decree to rebuild the temple. That was delayed by the opposition in the promised land, but some people got to return and they started on the work. And then King Darius of Persia, decades and decades later, he commanded the completion of the temple after he found the record stating Cyrus's intention. Well, here we are now with King Artaxerxes of Persia. He is allowing Ezra to return. Ezra has been told to us to be a man of God, a student of God's word, a teacher of God's word. And today we see the details of his journey back to Jerusalem. It's a fascinating thing to see how God works and how long God is willing to take to get everything lined up the way he wants before his temple will actually now function as it is designed to function. Let me show you what I mean. Chapter 8, we're first going to hear about the family heads actually, that are registered, that are going to move from Babylon back to Jerusalem. These are the family heads and those registered with them who came up with me from Babylon during the reign of King Artaxerxes. This is Ezra speaking then in this text. Of the descendants of Phinehas, Gershom. Of the descendants of Ithamar, Daniel. Of the descendants of David, Hattush. Of the descendants of Shechaniah. Of descendants of Paros, Zechariah, and with him were registered 150 men. I just want you to pay attention as we go through these lists, which most of us would look at these lists and go, well, I don't relate to that too well. Just the precision and the record keeping that has been maintained over decades in exile. There's no question about who belongs to who and what tribe they're from and what their function is in the whole system. Of the descendants of Pahath Moab, Elionai son of Zariah, with him 200 men. Of the descendants of Zatu, Shechaniah son of Jahaziel, and with him 300 men. Of the descendants of Aden, Ebed son of Jonathan, and with him 50 men. Of the descendants of Elam, Jeshiah son of Athaliah, and with him 70 men. Of the descendants of Shephatiah, Zabadiah son of Michael, and with him 80 men. Of the descendants of Joab, Obadiah son of Jehiel, and with him 218 men. Of the descendants of Bani, Shalomith son of Josephiah, and with him 160 men. And of the descendants of Bebai, Zechariah son of Bebai, and with him 28 men. Of the descendants of Azgad, Johanan son of Akatan, and with him 110 men. Of the descendants of Adonikam, the last ones, whose names were Eliphet, Juel, and Shemaiah, and with them 60 men. And of the descendants of Bigvai, Uthai, and Zakur, and with them 70 men. Listen to that. The first 14 verses of this chapter basically just are names, descendants, and numbers. But there's a lot of people moving from Babylon to Jerusalem. Ezra goes on in verse 15. He says, I assembled them at the canal that flows toward Ahava, and we camped there 3 days. When I checked among the people and the priests, now we come to a problem. I found no Levites there. Well, we're not going to go restart the sacrificial system in the way God designed it without Levites, right? So I summoned Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jerib, Elnathan again, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshulam, who were leaders, and Joiarib and Elnathan, who were men of learning. Elnathan is mentioned here, 3 times in verse 16. They were men of learning, we're told. And I sent them to Edo, the leader of Casaphia. I told them what to say to Edo and his kinsmen, the temple servants in Casaphia, so that they might bring attendance to us for the house of our God. In other words, I want some Levites because of the gracious hand of our God. This is very interesting. 18. Because the gracious God, or hand of our God was on us, they brought us Sherebiah, a capable man from the descendants of Mali, son of Levi, the son of Israel, and Sherebiah's sons and brothers, 18 men. So again, we're acknowledging what? That God is leading this expedition. And now Sherebiah comes to join us as a direct descendant of Levi, one who has the right to be a Levite priest. And Hashabiah, together with Jeshiah from the descendants of Merari, remember that's another descendant of Levi, and with his brothers and nephews, 20 men. They also brought 220 of the temple servants, a body that David and the officials had established to assist the Levites. They were all registered by name. That's the part I find fascinating. Over years and years of exile, these families continue to grow. Babies are born. Everybody is accounted for. All the names are registered. We know exactly who's who. It brings me to the reflection of modern times where the Jewish population of the world, who has been in exile, basically wiped out of the promised land for over 2,000 years, reassembles in the promised land in 1948, knowing that they are Jewish people. They're not scattered to the wind. Over millennia, they're able to keep track of their records. We see it demonstrated here in Ezra. They're all registered by name. There by the Hava Canal, I proclaimed a fast so that we might humble ourselves before our God. I love that, right? We need God's help. We're going to fast. We're going to pray. We're going to humble ourselves. We're going to ask Him for a safe journey for us and our children with all our possessions. This is a great line. I was ashamed to ask the king for soldiers and horsemen. In other words, the normal progression of travel would be, King, since you're allowing us to go, why don't you send us some backup so that we have protection? I want some soldiers. I need some horsemen to protect us from the enemies on the road. But Ezra is embarrassed to ask the king for that. Why? Because we had told the king, the gracious hand of our God is on everyone who looks to him, but his great anger is against all who forsake him. So we've already told the king that we're trusting God and that God is with us and that it's his mission. He will guard us and guide us. So how can I go to the king and say, but that's not enough. I need to have some horsemen and some soldiers. So apparently Ezra doesn't ask for that help. Instead, so we fasted and petitioned. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to fast and pray. We fasted and petitioned our God about this, and he answered our prayer. In other words, we didn't need soldiers and horsemen because God granted us safe passage. Then I set 12 of the leading priests, together with Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their brothers. Okay, God's answering, and I weighed out to them the offering of silver and gold and the articles that the king, his advisors, his officials, and all Israel present there had donated for the house of our God. I weighed out to them 650 talents of silver articles weighing 100 talents, 100 talents of gold, bowls of gold valued at 1,000 derricks, and 2 fine articles of polished bronze as precious as gold. I said to them, you, as well as these articles, are consecrated to the Lord. The silver and gold are a freewill offering to the Lord, the God of your fathers. Notice, Ezra's concern is everything about this, the people involved and the articles that are going to be transported, everything about this is consecrated. It's set aside for God. That's basically what the meaning of consecration means. We're setting these people and these articles into God's service. You're dedicated to him now. All right? Guard them carefully until you weigh them out in the chambers of the house of the Lord in Jerusalem before the leading priests and the Levites and the family heads of Israel. Notice verse 29. I know we're going to make it, and I know you need to watch these things because you're going to be using them there. Guard them until we get there. Then the priests and the Levites received the silver and gold and sacred articles that had been weighed out to be taken to the house of our God in Jerusalem. So the charge is there. They're prepared to guard. They're ready to go. On the 12th day of the first month, we set out from the Ahava Canal to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was on us, and he protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. So although there was some measure of fear, we thought about asking the king for soldiers and horsemen, but we decided to trust God. We fasted and prayed. We didn't want to deny God to these pagans by asking for protection after we told them that God's going to protect us. And guess what? Verse 31, God did protect us. He answered us. He protected us from enemies and bandits along the way. So we arrived in Jerusalem, where we rested 3 days. I imagine it's a long journey. On the 4th day in the house of our God, we weighed out the silver and gold and the sacred articles into the hands of Meremoth, son of Uriah the priest, Eleazar, son of Phinehas, who was with him, and so were the Levites, Jozabad, son of Jeshua, and Noadiah, son of Benuni. Everything was accounted for by number and weight, and the entire weight was recorded at that time. Again, logistics is a big deal, and these guys continue to keep the count. They are going to know how much, who has it, where it is. They can attest to the whole procedure. Then the exiles who had returned from captivity sacrificed burnt offerings to the God of Israel. So that's so monumental here in verse 35. The temple is reconstructed. It is now complete. And now the priesthood has moved into the area. And now we see the function of the temple resumed after how many years away? All right. They're sacrificing burnt offerings to the God of Israel. 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 male lambs, and as a sin offering, 12 male goats. All this was a burnt offering to the Lord. They also delivered the king's orders to the royal satraps and to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, who then gave assistance to the people and to the house of God. There it is, the return to Jerusalem. God has not abandoned his promise to Abraham. The disobedience of God's people has caused them to suffer his wrath. They've gone into exile for decades. Nonetheless, hundreds of years before it happened, God predicted through Isaiah that Cyrus would be one to send them back to the promised land. We watched him do that. We saw Darius then demand the completion of the temple. And now under Artaxerxes, we see the function of the temple up and running, and the people of God back in Jerusalem to run the temple. Amazing, God's faithfulness, God's willingness to restore, God's willingness to forgive. But yet, we have to keep in mind, God's judgment is real. So that's a good lesson for us today, church. Let's live the way God has called us to live so we don't go into spiritual exile, as it were, and don't suffer any sort of discipline on behalf of the Lord's correction for us. Instead, let's obey him with all our hearts today and serve him well. God bless you, church.
Who is it who for sinners shed his blood, and now for cleansing all can plunge beneath that flood? It's Jesus. But do you know who he is? He's future, the past, He is God.